Hello, wonderful humans out there in the world. This is Ethan Sawyer, the college essay guy. My goal here with the podcast is to bring more ease, joy, and purpose into the college application process. My job here is to interview the most brilliant minds in the college admissions world, analyze their genius, and then break it down for you in a series of practical, actionable steps that you can take, whether you're applying to college or helping someone else apply. My guest today, this is a really exciting one, is Edward B. Fiske. He's known to most folks as Ted, and he's well known especially for writing the Fiske Guide to Colleges. And if you know this book, I mean, especially if you're a counselor, this is a book that resides on your library and you get the new version every year. It's the nation's best-selling college guide. And, this book's been a go-to reference for me and a lot of other counselors in our work with students. And it was really cool getting a chance to just go behind the scenes a little bit and hear how this book was made, why it came to be. On the podcast, we talk about why did Ted even write the thing in the first place? I asked him how he avoids sounding generally positive about all schools, because I imagine that would be, a trap or a temptation. How the Fiske Guide rating system is different from that of U.S. News and World Report. He's got some cool things to say about that. I asked him who actually writes all 882 pages of the Fiske Guide. What the best approach would be for students who have no idea what they want, what advice he would give to them, how to use the guide itself, and what some of the biggest mistakes that students and parents make when they're searching for a school. Finally, we talk about the dangers of narrowing your college choices too early on, and he offers one quality that he finds essential to having an amazing college experience. So I had a lot of fun getting to know Ted a little bit, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. My guest today is kind of one of my heroes. I don't know if he knows that, so I haven't told him that directly, but he's known to you as Edward B. Fiske, known to his friends and the folks who know him as Ted. He served as the education editor for the New York Times from 1974 to 1991. He's well known to college-bound students and their parents as the editor of the Fiske Guide to Colleges. And if you go into pretty much any college counselor's office, you'll see this green book. It's a tome of the college application process sitting on their shelf, likely. In fact, if you just buy one book, this is probably the one you'd want to get. He's co-authored a range of other books on college admissions with Bruce G. Hammond, including The Fiske Guide to Getting into the Right College, What to Do When for College, and Real College Essays That Work. Oh, and also Nailing the New SAT, by the way. So Ted, I just want to say, first of all, this is a huge honor for me, and I feel like it's because of you and a few folks like you that have helped set the stage for a lot of us counselors. And so I just, really want to thank you for being on the podcast today. So welcome.
Well,
good morning.
It's my pleasure. Good morning. And I really appreciate all those nice things you said about them. I hope my wife is listening.
Well, so first of all, Ted, I'm just curious, what do you do and why do you do it? And you can take that to mean whatever you want to mean, but what do you do and why do you do it? Maybe college admissions related, but feel free to riff extemporaneously if you feel like it.
Well, I do. I'm a journalist. I spent 27 years at the New York Times as an editor and writer, first covering religion, then covering education. And the Fiske Guide got started while I was the education editor. It originally was the New York Times Selective Guide to Colleges, but then a lot of evolution took place, and it's become an eponymous Fiske Guide. But my other interest would be I do a lot of writing about education in developing countries. My wife, Helen Ladd, or Sunny Ladd, teaches public policy at Duke University, and she focuses on education policy. So I've lived in various places in the world writing about education in developing countries. So I basically am, on the one hand, a regular journalist, no longer with New York Times. I left the Times in the mid-'90s, but then also with the College Guide. So takes at least half of my time is spent on updating the Fiske Guide to Colleges.
And to the second part of this question, and this is maybe the harder question, but why do you do it?
Why do I do it? Well, I guess journalists are curious people, and it's a it's a wonderful profession for me because I do tend to have a lot of curiosity. I know something about how to write, and it's just interesting. And so what we've discovered, my wife and I, as we've wandered around the world looking at education systems in various countries, is that there's kind of a global marketplace for ideas about school reform, the same way there is about everything else from oil to pork belly futures. But then the other thing is that with the Fiske Guide, I have a sense that I like to think that I'm helping a lot of people. The whole college admissions process can be pretty daunting, and I think I have something to offer to students to maybe help them rationalize the system and help them find the right college that's for them. So I feel that it's helping a lot of people, and that's very satisfying.
You mentioned the Fiske Guide, and it's something that I think, as a counselor, having come into this, I felt like, well, it's kind of always been around. But of course, it wasn't always around in the literal sense of the word. Could you just give us the origin story for the Fiske Guide, why it came about, and perhaps a bit about how it came about?
Well, you have to flash back to the antediluvian days of the late 70s and early 80s. As you may recall, by that point, the baby boomers were finishing their treks through college. The number of high school graduates was declining, and a lot of college admissions officers were nervous about whether they'd be able to fill up the classes. And so they became much more aggressive in their recruiting activities. Now, as we look back on it, it all seems rather quaint. The aggressive marketing consisted of 4-color brochures in mailboxes and tapes, videotapes. I remember them. It was a story that I wrote about for the New York Times because they were doing sometimes kind of outrageous things. And I wrote about for the front page of the New York Times. I covered it for the business section of the Times. At one point, I wrote an article for Atlantic on the whole phenomenon. But the basic idea was colleges were beginning to market themselves, and that at that point was quite new. So I figured, and I had some conversations with the publisher of Times Books, which was a publishing arm of the New York Times at that time. And we decided maybe there was a need for somebody to come in and on the side of the consumer and cut through all of the propaganda that was coming from the colleges. And so that's essentially how the Fiske Guide came into being.
Wow. And it seems to me like such a monumental task of collecting all this information. I'd be curious to know about how that process began, and also how that's evolved and how the information on the colleges is gathered. So maybe the first part, how did you begin to collect all that information? Because that just seems like a huge task.
Well, the basic thing to remember is it's essentially a journalistic effort. What I do is a journalist asks people questions, writes down what they have to say, and then puts it out in a readable form for readers and viewers. And so what I do is essentially twofold. We have a questionnaire, which we send out to all the colleges that are in the guide. And we have about 325 schools. That's still only about 15% of all the four-year colleges in the U.S. But we send questionnaires to the administration, and they give us the kind of information that you would expect, not just applications and yield rates and that sort of thing. But also, we ask them, what's your educational vision? What are you trying to do? What are the curriculum requirements, the course requirements, and what's your rationale behind them? And so we ask these questions to the administration, and then we ask the administration to pick a small number of students to answer student questionnaires, and these are separate, and they're sent directly back to us. And we ask the students what it's like to be a student at your college. And so I'm asking things like everything from what's the academic culture? Is it intensive or laid back? Are students competitive with each other? Are they sabotaging each other's lab experiments? what's the social life and the cultural life in the dorms and so forth. And then we basically take what the two sets of questionnaires have given us, and we write up a narrative description of the school. And these are, as I say, narrative. There's a coherent little essays. They follow pretty much a set pattern of topics that we cover. And then we try to capture the institutional personality of the school.
That leads to two questions. One is, because I went to a session at NACAC a few years back where, one of the presenters was talking, the title was The Myth of Fit, and the notion that, because there's kind of, homogeneity in the resources or the propaganda, as you put it, that gets put out, that you've got liberal arts schools touting their sports programs and the schools known for sports touting their arts programs. How do you sort of suss through all this information for colleges who want to seem like they're pretty great at everything, or so I'd guess? How do you avoid being, general or just, sort of generally positive about all the schools? Is there some sort of process of weeding through for that, or how does that go?
Well, one of my assumptions, this was actually a little bit of a risk when we first started it, an editorial risk, because what I feared was that once you'd written about the 17th small liberal arts college in Ohio, where the faculty often invite the students to their homes for dinner, things would begin to sound alike and blend into each other. And it would be pretty dull reading. And what I found, much to my surprise and delight, was that colleges are very different. They have very distinct institutional cultures, very distinctive institutional personalities, and even schools that on paper kind of look alike, and they may be 15 miles down the road from each other, are quite different. They have different feel, they have different histories, they have different cultures. And so what I'm trying to do in these essays about each school, and they run anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500 words, depending on the school. What I'm trying to do is to capture that institutional personality. What seems to be the special feeling about this school, or what it's about. And then the assumption is that the reader, the potential undergraduate or parents, can then figure what's a good match for me. Is this kind of an institutional culture that I'd like to be part of?
And because there are so many, as you mentioned, so many different schools, and they are so different, how do you decide which colleges get selected for the guide? And in particular, like you mentioned 325 schools, which 325 get the honor of getting in the guide?
Well, that can sometimes be a matter of controversy, and some colleges that aren't in the guide often let me know about their disapproval of that decision. Although we do continually add schools, and we're open to changes. What we have basically the obvious schools, the ones that are most selective, the ones that are most desirable, or from a journalistic point of view, the schools that most readers are going to want to read about. So this would include all of the really selective schools, so the selective privates. It would include all of the major state universities, the flagship campuses. But then I basically look for a good representation of various niches of schools. I want to have some historically black schools. I want to have some evangelical schools. I want to have Roman Catholic schools. I want to have schools that are environmentally oriented. So I'm basically trying to anticipate the kinds of schools that readers are going to want to know about, and to then have a good representation of those. I'm also looking for geographic diversity. So a small liberal arts college in New England that's maybe marginal in terms of quality would have a lot less chance of being in the book than if it were located in Texas or Oklahoma or someplace where there just aren't a lot of liberal arts colleges. So what I want to do is to serve readers by giving them as many options as I can in their particular area.
So here's a question. If I'm a college and I want to get in the book, how do I convince you that I'm worth getting in the book?
I asked the colleges to write me a 2-page letter, no more than 2 pages. If I read more than 2 pages, my lips get tired reading. So I said, make the case for including and tell me along the way how you compare favorably with some schools that are already in the guide. And that system works pretty well. And I'm often persuaded by some of these letters.
What's your yield rate, Ted? In other words, and so for folks who don't know what that means, if you accept a certain college, about what percentage of them accept you back and decide they want to be in the guide? Is it pretty high?
I think my yield rate is about 100%.
Cool. So
but,
your ranking.
Nobody ever says they don't want to be in. Anyway, I'll take that problem when it comes.
Great. So in the intro, you mentioned a few different ratings or, criteria that you use when you're assessing the schools, just for folks who don't have the book in front of them: academics, campus setting, student body. You mentioned these: financial aid, housing, food, social life, extracurricular activities. I'm curious to know, what are your prejudices and values that have shaped the criteria for these ratings?
Well, actually, I'm glad you asked that, Ethan, because I really do. I try to think a lot about the values that I'm building into the Fiske guide, and especially as the higher education scene changes. I guess the first one would be that picking a college, and this is something that every guidance counselor is going to tell every kid. Yeah, so there's nothing original about this. Is that it's a matching process. It's a question of fit. One of the great bonuses about going to college in the United States is that the American system of higher education is so diverse. I mean, we've got 4,000 four-year colleges. And there's big ones and small ones, and rural and urban and religiously oriented and so forth. So there is this huge diversity. So there's no reason that any particular student can't find 12, 14, 20 schools that are going to be a good fit for them. So it is a question of finding a place where your particular needs are going to be served by the particular culture and institutional personality of the school. So this idea of finding the right fit, as opposed to saying this is the best school, is the key thing. And what I try to do is to encourage students to understand this and to have confidence that that there are schools out there that are going to be a good match for them, because there are. The answer is they can be sure that's true. I think the another thing would be what I just talked about, that the schools do have very different institutional personalities, and it's possible to look at them and describe them. We update every year with things like new dorms and new buildings and new majors and so forth. But the basic personality of the school that we're describing doesn't change very much. It was interesting. Even the former all women's colleges that became co-ed, in their case, their culture didn't change all that much, because the men who go to Vassar are in many ways have the same kinds of interests as the women who went to Vassar when it was still a women's colleges. I think another value would be what I just alluded to. The diversity is a good thing, and it's good that we have a diverse system. but I try to say in the write-ups that looking for diversity in the student body is an important value, and this is becoming more and more evident as we enter into a globalized society, a globalized world, that you're not really going to be getting a good education if everybody, or a high percentage of your fellow students, are just like you. That being exposed to different viewpoints, different students from different backgrounds, socioeconomic, geographic, national, or or whatever is really important, and it's essential to a good education these days. So, for example, I will, we in the last few years started giving reporting on what the percentage of students who are eligible for Pell Grants, which is to say federal money for low-income students, because the assumption is that being educated where there's some socioeconomic diversity among the students that you're rubbing elbows with is a positive thing. It's going to benefit you as well as the institution. I think globalization is another value. I mean, I did study abroad as a student myself. I've lived in a bunch of other countries. From the very beginning, we included some Canadian schools, write-ups about the four of the leading Canadian schools. Since then, we've added schools in Scotland, which are a good match for American students because they have a 4-year system that's comparable, that fits in easily with U.S. Educational patterns. We added Trinity College Dublin. So what I try to do is let students know about some of these other opportunities and encourage them to maybe think about even going to one of these schools. If not for 4 years, then maybe as an exchange student for a semester or a year. But then I've also, in the write-ups, done a lot more aggressive reporting about how many excuse me, reporting about how many international students they have, and then how many students at this particular school study abroad. So I've really built this, what you might call global awareness into the write-ups. And then I guess the final value that comes to mind would be I really believe strongly in the liberal arts education, liberal arts values, because whatever you learn of a technical sort is going to be obsolete, maybe even by the time you graduate. But learning to think and developing intellectual curiosity, learning to write and speak, these are the kinds of things which are the skills that are going to last you, not just get you the first job, but last for the whole for your whole career. And so I really do talk a lot in the book about how the college thinks about its curriculum as serving the broader purposes of liberal arts.
And in terms of rating the schools, or we'll say, comparing one school to the other, how does that work? Is it self-assessed? On the questionnaire, for example, is there like a 1 to 10? How well do you think you're doing? Or, is it just sort of you read the information that they've shared with you and you do some kind of internal assessment based on what you know and based on the information you get to give it a sort of, assessment? Or is there any kind of rating system? How does that go for you?
Yeah, I don't have a rating system comparable to U.S. News. I mean, I don't say this college is number 1, this is number 4, this is number 17. I mean, for a whole lot of reasons, I just don't think that's accurate. And what I do is I did want to have some kind of a way to help readers compare schools. And so as I said several times, I'm a journalist. And so I use the restaurant critic model of stars. So I assign a number of stars or telephones or other characters, not just stars, based on academics, based on social life, and quality of life. And so I have these 1 to 5 stars, although there aren't any 1, because if it was a 1, the question would come, why do you put it in the book? But anyway, so I do assign stars. But the purpose of that is really so that students can compare schools within it. They can look at this, the relation between the number of academic stars and the number of social stars, social being more measure of the quantity of social activity, and say it's a way of comparing the schools and, again, helping figure out whether this is going to be a good place for, it's going to reflect your values. But I don't pay a huge amount of attention to these ratings. The core of the book is the narrative description, and as I said, keep saying about what's it like to be there as a student.
Great. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the U.S. News and World Report rankings, because at this point, Ted, this is the 6th podcast episode. So anybody who's just coming into the podcast or coming into the college admissions process may not know about the U.S. News and World Report rankings. So all they may know is that those are the rankings that people go by. And they might even be developing a list based on those rankings. So I'd love for you to just say, give me, what's your take on the U.S. News and World Report rankings? And keep in mind that your listeners, again, may feel like this is the sort of the way to go and a place to look for, good and like the sort of be all end all.
Well, as I guess most people would know by now, that U.S. News publishes a lot of statistical data on schools, and then it assigns a ranking, and it ranks the schools 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So number 1 is this is a better school. So number 1 is a better school than number 7, and which is better than number 17. And so it's we're used to rankings. Americans love this kind of statistics and rankings, and we do it in lots of areas. When it comes to trying to pick a college where you're going to be spending a huge amount of money in 4 years, I know it's not a very good way to make this kind of a decision. For one thing, as you may have guessed from what we've been saying before, the U.S. News rankings asks the wrong question. The U.S. News says basically what's the best school and what's the second best and what's the third best. The right question to ask is what's the best school for me? There are a lot of really bright 17-year-olds for whom Harvard would be a terrible place, especially if you need a little nurturing and want to see a faculty member before you're a junior. It's that question of fit, and the U.S. News rankings don't pay any attention to this question of fit. They have this abstract they have a formula, and they say this school is better according to that formula. Another problem with the U.S. News rankings is it's all based on inputs. It looks at the SAT scores of the incoming students. It looks at institutional resources. It doesn't look at anything that happens once the student enrolls. So it doesn't say anything about the quality of the teaching or the academic climate. It's all based on some things that can be measured. You measure what you can measure. What the most important things about schools are not necessarily things that lend themselves to quantification. And closely related to that is it's essentially, U.S. News rankings are essentially a measure of institutional wealth. It used to be that there were plenty of public flagship universities like Berkeley and UCLA, and Michigan and all, that were at the top of their rankings. But over the years, the number of public institutions has declined. And private institutions, by definition, have bigger endowments and a lot of wealth. So essentially what the criteria that U.S. News uses for doing their rankings is pretty closely tied to wealth. So a rich school is going to do better, whether or not the faculty cares very much about teaching or not. And then finally, U.S. News has its own criteria, some of which I just talked about. But it might be theoretically possible for you, and they're not necessarily the criteria that are important for you. I mean, theoretically, you could take the U.S. News data and create your own ranking system based on your particular values, and that would be an improvement. It is useful for some data if you're comparing things like application numbers and yield rates and so forth. But it's the rankings are just they're what U.S. News editors think is important, and that's not necessarily going to be what's really important for you. I mean, years ago, and I know the editors of U.S. News. They've been around for a long time. The whole idea began as what they called some editors were sitting around. It was a journalistic parlor game, is the way they describe it. But somehow it's taken on a life of its own, and it's really important that students, if they're really thinking seriously about issues like fit, if they just don't pay much attention to those rankings.
Is there anything that the U.S. News and World Report rankings are useful for?
Well, they have a lot of data, and if you're getting to the point, especially late in the process, where you want to know where a particular aspect of a school is important to you, you can find data, but you can do that without buying into their system of without the editors telling you what's important.
Right. So the Fiske guide is, between 800 and 900 pages, and I have this, image in my mind of you sitting down each year just with a blank Microsoft Word document and starting with the first school and just typing until you get to 900 pages, redoing it each year. But
that's right. That's right. I start out, I write about Adelphi and work my way through to Yale, and that's that's exactly how it goes.
So just tell me, how does that go? Who writes the all pages, and how does that process go?
It would be an interesting experiment to figure out how much overlapping language there is between now and when the book first came out over 30 years ago. What we do is we update the write-ups every year. So we keep abreast of new buildings, new programs, new health centers, new dorms, all that sort of thing. And we update things like the statistics, like how many students study abroad, and all that. But so probably, by far most of the language in any particular write-up is not going to change all that much from year to year. And as I said, the one immutable thing is our description of the institutional culture. What's this place really like? And that does not change very much. It's like steering a battleship. And so what we do is we send out questionnaires both to the schools and we get questionnaires from the students each year, and then we read these, and then we read the current write-up, and in light of what the students are telling us, and then we update.
Great. And who's we? How big is just curious, I don't actually know this. How big is the team? How does that go?
Well, I have two principal assistants, one of whom who is actually my daughter, Julie, who works on sending the questionnaires out and maintaining our contacts. A lot of the questionnaires are filled out by institutional research people, and these they evolve every few years. There's new people. So she works on the follow-up and making sure that we get the information in. And then I have a managing editor, Michelle Lecoyer, who takes charge of the updating of the write-ups. And then I have a big hand in, not I say heavy hand, I have a big hand in doing that and sort of setting general editorial directions. And then I have a wonderful publisher, Sourcebooks, in Illinois, and in Naperville, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. And then there's just a whole bunch of really good folks on the Sourcebook staff who deal with all aspects, from helping to send out the emails through the computer system to proofreading and quality control and that sort of thing. So it's a little hard to answer how many people are involved. As I said, I have two basically on my staff, but it's very much a collegial activity.
Ted, when do you feel the guide is most useful in the process of applying to college?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I like to say that it's useful at any point in the process. I would say there are two there are 2 points where it's particularly valuable. The first would be at the very beginning. I mean, I want to go to a 4-year school. There are 2,200 of them to choose from. How in the world do I even start? Do I just kind of throw the book down the stairs and see what pages fall out? So it's a way to begin to think about what your values are. And there's a little quiz at the beginning of the book called Sizing Yourself Up, which allows you to suggest some questions you could ask about the sort of place that you might want to go to. And so identifying some schools to begin the search is one point. But then also broadening your horizons a little bit. And what I suggest is to a lot of students is if there's a school that that you might be interested in, then look at the schools that they share a lot of applicants with. And we list those at the end of each write-up because you can take the advantage of the fact that other students coming before you have seen, if you like one school, you might like this. So that's a way of looking at the overlapping admission applications. But basically, as a tool for narrowing the search and at least getting started. And of course, I encourage students to visit different types of schools. Visit an urban one, visit a rural one, visit a big one, visit a small one, just to get a little sense of what's going to be good for you. And then I suppose at the very end of the process, where you have maybe you have offers from 3 or 4 schools, and you want to start doing a comparison of them on particular things that are important to you. Are you really concerned about the quality of the dorms or the sports programs or what? So at that point, you can use the book in a very different way, and that is to look at what the write-ups say about each of these schools on a particular point, like the quality of the dorms or do you have to be a member of a fraternity to have a decent social life, things like that. So they're a little bit more compare and contrast. But other than that, at any given point, questions are going to arise, and the book sits there, all 800 pages of it, ready to help you out.
Right, and because it's such a big guide, let's get just really practical. So, you mentioned, for example, the Sizing Yourself Up section, where you identify a bunch of these qualities. Say I'm a student who's trying to develop a good college list. Would it make sense to just start at that Sizing Yourself Up section and just kind of?
Well, let me just maybe speak from my own personal experience. I grew up in Philadelphia, went to one of the Quaker schools in Philadelphia, and I wanted to go to a small liberal arts college in New England. And one of the reasons was that I knew I wanted to be able to do lots of different things and not have to specialize, which is why I wanted a smaller school. And as it worked out, I went to Wesleyan in Connecticut, which is one of the better small liberal arts colleges in the country. And I was able to play sports, and I edited the newspaper and did other things as well as keeping up my grades. So I wanted a smaller school simply because I didn't want to have to go to, I didn't have to specialize. If I'd gone to a larger school and I wanted to be on the newspaper, it really would have been difficult to play sport as well. And so what I did was, now there wasn't a Fiske guide to help me, of course, but if I were to do this again with this coming at it with the same attitude that I had then, I would look up Wesleyan or Amherst or school and then read about them and then look at the overlaps that they had and maybe develop a list of 15 or 20 schools to read about, and then you can begin to focus in on where you might want to go visit. But so it's you find some kind of a little hook, something that's interesting and you're interested in. I mean, are there some people want the fun of being in a school with Division I sports? So pick a school that looks like like Michigan or something that might. And then look at the schools that they compete with academically and otherwise.
And speak to the kids, the students who are listening who have just no idea what they want. They think, I want to go to college, or I feel like I should go to college, but I have no idea what I'm looking for. What's the best way for them to approach this?
Well, one thing I warn students about is narrowing your choices too early. I mean, most people, they say, well, I want to go and be an anthropology major. Well, chances are pretty good you're going to change your mind 4 or 5 times before you end up doing that. So I think it's really important to go to pick a school where you're going to have other options, because you're going to one of the things about college, and one of the purposes of education, is to let you know that things exist that you had no idea of. So it may very well be that you get to school and turns out there's a medieval Urdu teacher who is really captivating and turns on your intellectual curiosity and is going to teach you a lot about how to think. Maybe you didn't even know there was such a thing as Urdu until you got there. So you really need to keep your mind open and not just go in very heavily with a heavily prescribed program. Where I'm going to study this, and this, and let the intellectual culture of the school wash over you. And so it would be to look for places where you are going to have lots of options. And now there are people in some fields, for example, engineering, where you do have to specialize a lot earlier because there's so much to cover. And so that's somewhat of a special case. But on the other hand, there are a lot of first-rate engineering schools where they very much teach engineering within the culture of the liberal arts. That's the sort of thing that you can look for, and make sure that you do what you want, but also keep in mind the intellectual context of the place.
Right. And I love this sizing yourself up section at the beginning of the book that you mentioned, which basically, for those who haven't seen it yet, identifies 30 qualities that students, could or should consider. In your mind, are there any particular qualities that are, this is a weird way to put it, but like more important than others? Or are there if you had to do like a top 3 things to consider list, what would be some of those qualities that you think are really important students should definitely think about?
Yeah, I mean, there are values. Like, for example, do you like to be a big fish in a smaller pond? Do you like to be one of the smarter people in the room? Or do you get a kick out of being surrounded by people who are a lot smarter than you are? You find that that's stimulating. And there's not a right or wrong answer for this. This is just a question of temperament. So that's the kind of a question when you're picking between a big school or a small school. I've already talked about, do you want to be able to participate in lots of activities, or do you want to focus on one or two? And then there's a question of how you learn best. Sometimes a lot of people can handle large lectures and of course with tutors afterwards, but can learn very well from big large lecture classes. Others really thrive on seminars and want the give and take of students among themselves and students with the faculty. It's not a question of right or wrong. It's just that different schools offer different kinds of learning environments, and let's just try to figure out what's one that's best for you. Do you want to do undergraduate research? This has been a huge trend in recent years with colleges letting undergraduates work on serious research projects, and the colleges do this in very different ways. And even small liberal arts colleges, there you have where the faculty members are there primarily to do research. But schools like that, the faculty members tend to pick research projects that lend themselves to having undergraduates do some of the grunt work on it, as opposed to big universities where you're immediately thrust into big science. So it's issues like that.
And you mentioned, one of the mistakes that parents and students sometimes make is early on narrowing their options a little bit too early. Are there any other big mistakes that you see students and parents making when it comes to?
Yeah, well, as I think that's the big one, is just to decide to not look at the overall number of schools. I think another big mistake is assuming that the published tuition price is definitive for you. I mean, college is hugely expensive these days, but colleges have to discount their prices in order to get students, and so what you pay is going to be a function of what their tuition is, but also how much they want you, how much need-based financial aid you might be available to you, and then how much they really want you. There's a lot of schools have merit aid, and so if there's a school that you really want to go to, don't write it off at the very beginning as something that's going to be impossible, because it might not be. I mean, it might be, but you have to really have a conversation with them, and then there's another sort of localized issue that I advise women: don't write off the women's colleges if you're a woman. Some of the best education that's available is in these women's schools, and they aren't monasteries anymore, but they are places that take women seriously. And colleges can be pretty sexist places, especially in larger classes. Men tend to want to dominate the airspace, and this is not necessarily the best place for women. And you're not sacrificing quality if you go to a women's college, because places like Bryn Mawr and Wellesley are among the best schools in the country. So don't, if you're a woman, at least think about the fact that you might want that a women's college might be the best fit.
Yeah. I mean, I see this a lot, where students or parents sort of get obsessed with one school or two schools, and usually those schools happen to have fewer than, less than 10% acceptance rate. What's the danger in that, in your mind, in terms of narrowing? You mentioned this is really the big thing, is narrowing the choices. What danger do you see in that, or what is the potential cost of that?
Well, I think you're not being sensitive to the richness of American higher education, as we said at the earlier. One of the definitive things about U.S. higher education, it is so diverse. I mean, in Europe, students tend to go to the university it's in the closest city to them. There's not a lot of different personalities among the institutions. In the United States, it's not that way at all. There is this, and I think a lot of it goes back to the fact that higher education in the United States a lot of it was founded by religious organizations, and the different churches wanted to have their own colleges and universities so they could promote their own teaching. So they tend to be located in outside of big cities. There are not very many small liberal arts colleges in cities, if you think about it. And even Cambridge was out in the boonies when Harvard was started. It wasn't in Boston. It still isn't, actually. It's in Cambridge. New Haven was New Haven. Princeton was a tiny town. So there is this diversity out there, and you might as well take advantage of it, because to go back to what we were saying before, there are dozens of schools that are going to be a good fit for any particular individual.
Ted, is there anything that you feel students should really consider doing during this process, but many often don't actually do?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I really encourage, whenever possible, to visit some schools, because there's something about being on a campus, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just schools that you're really, really interested in. I think it's a good, visit a larger one, visit a smaller one. But there's something just about being on a campus and maybe getting a feel for what's going on. You can always walk into it's a good idea to walk into the cafeteria and look around, and do you see students and faculty talking to each other, or the faculty in one corner and the students in another? And if you're bold enough, it doesn't hurt to just walk up to some students and start asking them about what it's like in most colleges. And this is something that's been pretty important to the success of the Fiske Guide. Is most college students are pretty happy with where they went and are happy to talk about it, but they're also going to be very candid. They're not going to. They understand that they're not doing anybody a favor if they delude some potential freshman into coming and it's not the right fit. That's not good for the freshman or for the school. So, to the extent that you can, get on a physical campus and just get a sense of what it's like to be a college student. And one thing to remember is that, in a very real sense, the college admissions process itself is the first step in your education. So think of it as part of your college education, because what you're doing is you're looking at schools. You're asking questions. Well, what am I really interested in? Why am I doing this? What are my goals? And as you deal with these questions, then you're going to end up at a place that's a good fit for you. But also, that's the first step when you start asking yourself about your priorities. That's very much. You're going to be doing that for 4 years, asking similar questions. So think of the application process as part of your college education.
Boy, I couldn't agree more. And I would even say life, right? Life education in terms of, how to make decisions. Because in a lot of cases, this is, the first time a student's really going to be making a big, big decision that can impact potentially the rest of their lives. And that maybe kind of goes without saying, but.
Yeah, and the other thing I guess I might add is that know that you're going to be successful. When I talk to kids who are really anxious about the process, I know that 12 months from then, they're going to be in a place that's a good match for them, assuming they use a little bit of common sense. And they're going to wonder about, what was all the Sturm und Drang? Why was I so anxious about this? And that you are going to be successful. If for some reason you end up at a place that has some dimensions that you weren't aware of, you can always transfer. That's not the end of the world. But by and large, you should enter the process, and both as students, and this is advice to parents as well, knowing that you're going to be successful because of all the things we've been saying. There is this diversity. There are dozens of places that'll be a good match for you. You just have to find at least one of them.
Yeah, I love that advice to visit a campus too. One thing I say to students is to make sure you visit 3 schools that are clearly different. So what that could mean is a small school, mid-sized school, large school, a rural school and an urban school, just to get really get a kinesthetic, a bodily sense of what feels right. So.
Yeah, I agree. That's really important. And I'm a journalist, so I like being out and being involved in situations and meeting people and seeing things. So maybe that's a bias, but I think it's generally applicable.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ted. This is incredibly useful, and anybody, throw a rock, and if you're in the college admissions world, and you'll find Fiske Guide, but obviously you can get it online, or obviously you can get it in bookstores, but you can also get it online. Could you just say a little bit about what the online world has opened up in terms of the Fiske Guide? In other words, who would prefer to get the printed copy, the hard copy, and who might prefer an online copy?
Well, actually, what we found is that most people really want the physical book. I mean, there's an iPad app for it. There is an online version of it. Um, right now, we're having some hacking problems with the website, but we'll deal with those. Um, but it seems to be one of those products where people just kind of want the physical book, and you want to be able to sort of take it with. It's not the sort of thing that lends itself to hours in front of a screen browsing. For some reason, and I don't pretend to understand anything in this world, but it's the physical book that people seem to want, and so the sales it's the leading guide. We have we sell more copies, and there's greater market share than any other guide. So, but it is available online, and then if you're in another country, of course, and you don't want to ship the book around the world, it's a big help. But so there is an iPad version and there is an online version. And the Sourcebooks website, sourcebooks.com, would have links to all these.
Yeah, I'll link it all to the show notes, and I'll give the where folks can pick it up. At the end of the show, Ted, I like to do a little portion called Show and Tell, where each of us shares just something that we feel has either been useful in our lives, or currently or in the past, that might be useful to other folks, and that could be in the college admissions world, or it could be something outside that, something that's just that you would like to share. And I tend to, by the way, not prepare my show and tell thing until I've heard the guest share. But is there something that comes to mind for you, Ted, that you'd like to bring for show and tell today?
I don't know. I guess to me, and this is maybe too closely related to what we've been talking about, but I just think curiosity is. I have a lot of trouble with people who aren't curious, and maybe that's my hang-up. But as I said, being a journalist, curiosity is something that you traffic in a lot. But what I found when I went to what was supposed to be a fairly good high school, but it wasn't all that. I thought there was a lot that I was missing, and it was really when I got to Wesleyan that I sort of discovered the world of ideas and really got turned on to the fun of learning about different things. And as I said, it meant, it was kind of learning anything is fun. I mean, I studied ancient Greek just kind of for the fun of it, but the idea of the serendipity of knowledge, the fact that you can, that there are a lot of, there are interesting people, of course, and interesting writers. But again, this would maybe go back to what I was saying about the liberal arts, that being open to the fun of ideas, wherever they are, and then just seeing where they lead you. It's just one of the great joys of life.
I'm just nodding as you're saying this, Ted. You don't know this, but the tagline for this podcast is "Stay curious."
Oh, really? Okay.
It is. Thank you for that reminder. And so my show and tell is, as I've worked with this book this amazing resource that you've created, and spent the last 10 years helping students with this process, I've kind of developed my own version of how to create a great college list. So in the show notes, folks will be able to click a link, and you'll be able to see in the first part of the process, well, how do you figure out, how do you get really curious and figure out what it is that you're looking for? And then in part 2 of the guide that I'll share, how can you use great resources out there, one of which is the Fiske Guide, to find schools that could potentially be, a good match for you. And then how do you whittle it down and decide which, number of schools to apply to? So my show and tell is a resource that folks can check out in the show notes. Ted, thank you. Again,
Good.
It's such an honor to speak with you, and I just really appreciate
Well,
your time.
thank you, Ethan. It's been a real pleasure. It's nice to have somebody push me to think about some of these things, because I do get a lot of satisfaction not only about learning about U.S. higher education, which is incredibly diverse and interesting and always changing and keeping up with things, but also like the feeling that maybe I'm useful to some people and helping them sort out where they're going to go to school and how they're going to get prepared for the rest of their lives.
Well, I just want to, on behalf of the college admissions community, as a professional in this community, I just want to say that your contributions cannot be undervalued. It's just been huge, and so thank you for all your great contributions.
Thank you. You're very kind.
Thanks so much for listening. You can check out in the show notes my practical guide, how to create a great college list. I encourage you to check that out. Or you can just Google that phrase and that'll pop up for you. And that's it. I hope you have an amazing week. Bye.